Lin, I've got to say for you to last, because I think that, I don't think Goldman Sachs has done tremendous amount of work in studying this demographic. China, obviously, is the big story in terms of how Asia is developing in terms of how the demographic is moving forward. A lot of the reference fintech, etc., is coming out of China. You have a personal experience as well that you can share with us today. So what's your view on how that's
Well, thanks very much for the introduction, Paul, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. So as Paul mentioned, at Goldman Sachs, millennials is a big theme for us. And we actually recently hosted a millennials conference, which is, to our surprise, one of the best attended events. And as someone who grew up in China, and then as a millennial myself, I actually shared some of my personal perspectives as someone who grew up there. And then maybe I'll share with you some of that key points that might complement a lot of what has been said, but also bring it to life about what it is like to be a Chinese millennial today. So I will touch on two things. Firstly is what are the common traits that make the Chinese millennials very similar to this global millennials cohort, and I'll touch on three things with that. And the second thing is, what is the distinct features that separate them and make them unique from the other millennials, be it the Westerners or the other Asian millennials? And then I guess the first question to clarify is actually the millennial term itself, because in China we don't use the term millennial. It's actually a very little known term. So we have the equivalent of the post-90s and the post-80s generation, just very much divided by the decade. So let me just touch on the three key things I think that makes the Chinese millennials very similar to this global cohort. The first one is consumerism. And there's no doubt about it, we're very powerful consumers. And I think one of the examples is the attitude towards property ownership. So people might have all heard about the property bubble in China and also the affordability issue that has been touched on. I think in the major cities these days, it takes a person on average 55 years to get to property, which is a huge issue for a lot of the millennials. But if I think about how that issue has started, it actually was quite recent, because the housing reform was only started in 1998. So before that, the Chinese people weren't allowed to own their property. So as property was always seen as a form of financial security, that means there is also this chase to get the property themselves. So to simply put, if I wanted to marry someone in Shanghai, for example, my parents would never allow it unless that guy owns a flat. Hence, we have this saying in China called "no flat, no love." So this is, and then there's a girl who recently said this in a Chinese dating show, and I think that illustrates this quite nicely. So she said, "I would rather cry in BMW than smiling at the back of a bicycle." And I think that certainly illustrates this kind of materialism and consumerism that define this generation, which is not dissimilar to the global millennials generation. So the second point is this globalization. China benefited hugely from this. It was once a very isolated country, and we grew up to witness that China has grown up and opened up. So in China, there are about 400 million people who learn and speak English. So this language skill gives them huge connectivity to the global population. And then that means, actually, if you look at some of the attitudes towards certain issues, the Chinese millennials are very similar to the global peers. So someone mentioned about the social responsibility and the investment in that area. I think that's a very similar attitude towards them. And then also, when I asked about the same-sex marriage, for example, 70% of the Chinese millennials are in favor of it, and that is a very similar percentage of that in the US. So the last thing I want to touch on is actually the technology. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. That is a huge theme, not just for the millennials, but also for the entire Chinese population. Today, 97% of Chinese millennials own a smartphone, which is way above the global average. On the whole population level, WeChat, as people know, which is the equivalent of WhatsApp or Line, actually has almost 1 billion users. So, of which, of course, half of that would come from the millennials generation. The mobile technology that enables people to pay is also phenomenal there as well. The top app within that is WeChat Pay that has 600 million users, and then the next one, Alipay, which is part of the Alibaba franchise, that has 400 million users. So while this is a very kind of top-down, bottom-up, everyone is using technology, I actually think it did start with millennials generation not so long ago. The first example I can trace back to probably in 2005, and this is when the TV show called Supergirl gained popularity. So this is the equivalent of the X Factor, but the difference is this show received about 800 million text votes. It counts on multiple occasions, but most of them are coming from the millennials generation. Actually, it has been described as one of the most democratic movements in China. As many people in the room, the Chinese millennials use new technology, and they were very powerful in that. So I guess these are the 3 key things that are very similar to the global millennials generation: the consumerism, the globalization, and the access to technology. But I also want to touch on 3 things very quickly, why I think they're very distinct and sometimes unique for that reason. And I'll probably expand on the first theme, which I think is the one-child policy. And if we have time during Q&A, I'll touch on the second and third theme, which is the generation gap and also different outlook. So just on the one-child policy theme, I myself belong to that generation. So I can count in one hand the people that I know that have brothers and sisters. For us, being the single child is the norm. The one-child policy is synonymous with the millennials term. It's synonymous with economic reform in China. And I'll leave you with 3 things that define this generation from my own personal perspectives as well. So, first thing is this family structure change. So this created this 4-to-1 structure, means the 4 grandparents, the 2 parents, and the single child. Because before, the Chinese have very big families as well. So it's no wonder this child becomes the center of the attention and receives access pampering, because the parents only got 1 shot, so they kind of have to get this right. And for this exact reason, we would refer to, especially the post-80s generation, as the little emperors. Secondly, being little emperors, there is a price to pay, and that is the huge expectation to succeed. So not only do we have to live our lives, we almost have to live our parents' lives as well, because they lived through the Cultural Revolution. So just to give you an example, so my mom always wanted to be a pianist when she was young, but she didn't have access to such resources when she was 5 years old. So as a result of that, she bought me a piano when I was 3, allegedly some early discovered musical talent. Then at the time, my family's whole net worth was about £200. It's really bizarre if you think about it, because it's so low, but actually it was really common, because back then the state provides you your housing, your food, your clothes, so you actually don't need that much of access cash for yourself. But this piano was a very luxurious item and a cost more than what we could afford. So in order to finance this £100 shortfall to buy this piano, my mom took on them. So at the time, she was a medical intern, so her monthly salary was about £4. So she chose to work every weekend for 3 years to earn £3 extra per month to pay that off. It was that kind of determination that just made you feel almost compelled to do well. The last point is this competition, because my parents are not alone in this. Every parent is doing pretty much the same thing. So we grew up in a hugely competitive environment. Every year there are over 10 million people that is set for the national entrance exam, competing for 10,000 seats at top universities. That's the kind of odds you have to go against China. So I went through the system myself. I certainly remember when I was in primary high school, I used to go from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. So sometimes I say to my colleagues, this must be my destiny to work for Goldman Sachs, where the hours are still very similar. But I'll probably put it here and then share the rest at the Q&A.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Lin. That's very, very exciting. Do we have